Welcome.
This is an important conference for a number of reasons, both economical and political. If this conference does not take decisions to do something to stop the insidious media campaign and the day-by-day campaign to undermine and sabotage the will of the people in the referendum in 2016, it will have failed in its task. I would remind you, as previous speakers have, that on the 23rd of June 2016, we took a momentous decision. The ruling class didn't realise, anticipate or expect that there would be a vote to leave the European Union. As a result of that decision, we have witnessed the most not only insidious but sustained and unprecedented media campaign probably in the last 30 years. Every television station within this nation has consistently referred to Brexit. Even Children's Hour will mention Brexit in the negative. The weather forecast will say there is a strong likelihood of a storm from the North Sea, no doubt caused by Brexit. I feel that anyone listening or looking at our television screens will come inescapably to the conclusion that the media is clearly acting as an instrument on behalf of the ruling class to destroy and sabotage the votes of 17.5 million citizens of Britain. When we look at what they say and do, we have an obligation, a responsibility to not only deny what they say, but to counteract it. Today we've heard from Kim, from Ian, from Costa, from Ken, from Doug, and from everybody who's spoken from this platform, the case against membership of the European Union. But we need to understand, all of us, what the issues are now, and more important, where we go from here. First of all, the campaign for a people's vote. What a nonsense. We've had one. I'm not talking about the referendum. That stupid woman who claims to be Prime Minister called a general election a year later. A people's vote. Well, if you look at the two together, it's a very interesting mathematical calculation. 75% of Conservative constituencies voted to leave the European Union. 61% of Labour constituencies voted to leave the European Union. Now, if that vote was reflected in the House of Commons, there wouldn't even be a debate. They would represent the will of their constituents. And if there's one thing that's crystal clear. For electoral change, it is to scrap this nonsense that we have of constituencies and revert to the original concept of the Independent Labour Party and the Communist Party for proportional representation, so that those who get the most votes democratically have the right to determine policy. Must be right. If that policy had been implemented in America, we wouldn't have had this nutcase in power. Maybe another one, but not quite as bad as this. People's vote can be misinterpreted. What we need is action. That's been shown many times throughout history, but never more so than in the city of Birmingham. In 1972, I paid my first visit to the city of Birmingham. I didn't even know where it was. I travelled on a Saturday afternoon after an emergency call to come and see if we could stop the flow of coke that was being transported against the arrangements that had been made from a coke depot out of Birmingham. My idea of a coke depot was one that held about 50 tons of coke. I couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. But something told me I ought to go along with the 500 Yorkshire miners who decided to come with me. But I had to ask the way. And the spaghetti junction prevented an obstacle. So I had to go into a compound to see if there were any people around, to find out where a club was run by the Communist Party. And I went in, and suddenly I saw more police than I'd ever seen in my life, in lorries, in containers. I thought, it must be a convention. And I went up, I said, excuse me, could you tell me where the Star Social Club is, near the Bull Ring in Birmingham? Reasonable question. You haven't got a clue, man. They come from Glamorgan. I said, oh. He says, only been here an hour. I thought, it must have relatives. Well, I soon found out what the issue was. They were staging a mass demonstration of the state forces to ensure that that coking plant stayed open. And for the next 4 days, the battle that took place is probably unprecedented since the battle at Peterloo. We faced incredible odds. And without assistance, there is no way that we could have succeeded. We needed the support of workers. And to their eternal credit, the engineers, the transport workers, and the engineers in this, at the time, the powerhouse of Britain, decided that they would heed the plea. And on the 10th of February 1972, they turned out and stopped this city. And in doing so, changed the whole nature of the dispute which the miners of Britain were involved in. It went down in history. But it did more than that. It provided the kind of beacon light that you and I have to have in order to defeat those who seek to betray the will of the people in the referendum of 2016. We've got to get the people out on the streets of Britain to stop this sabotage that's taking place. As Doug said, you know, it's not a mysterious thing when you've had a vote. What they don't tell you on television or on the radio programs or in the press is what Article 50 means. In the case of Britain, different from the other European states, we could have withdrawn from the European Union on the day after the referendum. Now, you've heard how much from those silly Tories who couldn't add two and two together. On a battle bus, they said, if we come out of the European Union, we will be able to have £350 million to spend on the National Health Service. Well, that was challenged. And The Guardian, that bastion of socialism, said, it's wrong. If you take into account the Thatcher discount, it's only 240 million that we will save by not going in and staying in the European Union. I've got news for you. I think the figures were wrong, but not like they do. I calculate, briefly with my economic training, not good, 3 years at Leeds, but there you are. I think we would save 1.4 billion per week. Tell you how, shall I? Not only the 242 million that we would save in the contribution we make as a net contributor to the European Union, but taking into account the fact that in trade with the European Union nations, we are £80 billion in debt each year. Yet with the rest of the world, we're 41 billion in surplus. If anyone told a member of this audience to go to a shop down the road where they would sell you a product with that difference, you'd think they'd gone completely crackers. So the only thing that you've got to take into account is the amount of money that could be saved economically by withdrawal from the EU. And I say it's 80 billion in trade, because I don't believe in a free market either. I'm a socialist. I'm a Marxist, in case my credentials are going to be questioned about Trotsky or anybody else. And I believe in import controls. The 1945-1951 government, Labour government, imposed import controls in order to sustain the British economy. Common sense. You don't do things to the detriment of your economy. We faced a situation that needs to be compared now with what we had before we went into the European Economic Community, with a vote only of the government under Edward Heath, and then with a vote in 1975 in which Tony Benn, Jeremy Corbyn and I spoke all over Britain against remaining in the EEC. we had an interesting economic base. Prior to our membership of the Economic Community and later the European Union, 80% of our economy was based in manufacture. We had a coal industry. We had a massive steel industry, an education system in services. We had heavy and light engineering. We had a fishery industry, agriculture. We produced over 82% of our own food. Today, it's 59%. We've got no coal industry left. The steel industry is gone. 84% of our steel comes in from abroad at a cost to Britain and its economy. It's economic madness. And yet we talk about why we should be leaving the European Union. But these things need to be stressed. And I'm going to stress a few more things about betrayal. Not only by those who claim to be nationalists, but those in the labour and trade union movement who ought to know better. Quite frankly, someone needs to be explaining the facts of life to them. All the arguments at the moment are on a backstop, a border in Ireland. It's an absolute red herring. It's a diversion. There's no problem about a border in Ireland. There's a simple solution. Let's have a united Ireland, and then we can get the fulfillment of a promise made. Now, who could object to that? Put them in a bit of a problem, wouldn't it? I remember speaking in Dublin and in Belfast with Sinn Féin against the European Union. And suddenly, in 2015, they changed their position. And I told Adams and McGuinness the policy was wrong. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. I'll tell you why they did it. For the misguided view that it was for electoral gain. And in the election that followed, they lost 2 seats to people who were against austerity and wanted a better life for the people of Ireland. I'll tell you how you could have a border in Ireland, shall I? Simply go back to the border we had between 1922 and 1998. Nothing wrong with that. It worked. And by the way, when we talk about crossings in Ireland, it's the joke of the century. 296 crossings. That's what the media tell us. Anybody that's been to Ireland recently and examined those crossings, you couldn't get a bloody bike past them. The dirt tracks, the main arteries, for example, from Derry into Donegal, there's 2. I know them well. A14, A13. That's it. And it's the same all through Ireland. There is no problem whatsoever. So until and unless anybody comes to the conclusion that we ought to have a united Ireland, simply revert to the borders that we had between 1922 and 1998 at the date of the Good Friday Agreement. There's no problem whatsoever. Incidentally, the nonsense that it's the only country where there's a land area between one section and another is untrue. Take Cyprus. You've got part of Cyprus within the EU and part of Cyprus occupied by the Turks. because that's the reality, and divided. And what about Yugoslavia, split asunder by people who question what the Russians have done with the Crimea? Not one word about what's happened with them in Yugoslavia. Interestingly, of course, as Costas said and others said about what has taken place in the world as a whole, we've seen changes taking place because we're internationalists, not nationalists, but we have a national identity. Someone said to me when I spoke in Dublin, Connolly, in their view, would have voted for membership of the EU. I said, not on your life. I've got his text. I can tell you what Connolly said. Connolly made the point very clearly. He said that he wanted a republic, but the republic I wish for our fellow countrymen is a republic that should be such a character that the mere mention of its name will for all time serve as a beacon of light to the oppressed of every land. The great Jim Larkin said something similar and said, we want an independent Ireland, a united Ireland, but one that's controlled by Irish men. He meant women as well in Ireland. That's the policy that we should be pursuing against those who talk about a border problem in Ireland. What the socialists in Ireland and those who paid the ultimate sacrifice when they were executed, murdered by the British state in the Rising in 1916. In other words, take into account the reality of the world and internationalism and nationalism. Throughout the world today, you've got example after example of land areas within the European Union that border countries that are not within the European Union. No problem whatsoever. Try going from a European Union country into Russia, uninterrupted. And by the way, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with the border control? I don't know how many people have travelled recently by train from St. Pancras to either Belgium or France. But it's an interesting experience. When you go to the station, you first of all are confronted, not with free movement, a bloody long queue. The second thing you're confronted with is a passport control. A British passport control. You get through that after they look at you, and then you're faced with the French passport control. So you've got to go through two. And then you go through all your baggage being searched. Now, if that's right, for movement of people now, where's the problem? As far as movement of people are concerned. They're not talking about the movement of people in that sense. They're talking about the movement of labour. They're talking about the movement of cheap labour from one nation to another, throughout Europe, wherever it suits capitalism. And it's not confined to those people who support withdrawal from the European Union. That hypocrite who manufactures sweeping machines, who's now going to be doing the electric car, I'm talking about Dyson, What's he going to do? He's going to build them in Singapore. What a bloody hypocrite. If he really meant what he said, he should have been building them in Britain. There's no reason on earth why we can't have a sensible economic policy. But we have to change, and we have to make sure that that economic policy meets the aspirations of the people of Britain. Our economy is in a mess, and the world itself is facing the greatest economic crisis probably in its history, eclipsing that one in 1929 and certainly the one in 2008. We're facing real problems. You only have to look around you. And as people have said from this platform, not only in Britain, but in France and in Germany, look at the disruption that's taking place, all caused by international capitalism, and in European terms, with the European Union. That's the kind of policy that we've got to face, and more important, what we've got to do something about. And Costas made the point very eloquently about the power of Germany. It's a very interesting comparison. They happen to produce all the things that we used to produce. In this city, for example, we used to produce our own British motor cars. In the Midlands, we used to produce Rolls-Royce and Bentley cars. Do you know who produces them now? They produce them in Germany. The rail system. Nobody's mentioned that today, but I will. The majority of our railway system, which is a real cock-up, is partly owned not by the British people in any way, but it's owned 70% by international consortiums, the majority of which are based in Europe. And ironically more still, some of those are nationalised. So we've got nationalised railway systems in France owning private railway industries in Britain. The sooner we make it clear that we've got a national political policy as well as an international policy, the better for all of us in the labour and trade union movement. We were told earlier this year, for the first time, Britain has produced electricity without having to resort to a fossil fuel like coal. The biggest lie in the last 50 years. Do you know where we got the majority of our energy from during that period? Germany, who produced it from coal. It's called brown coal. It's the most inferior coal there is. And yet in Britain, for those who don't know it, we developed and could do it, a carbon capture system that produces coal and turns it into electricity or gas or liquid without the exposure in any way of CO2 or any other of the dirty man problems that there are with the production of carbon. We can do it. And who are producing it now? They're doing it in America, they're doing it in China. And here in Britain, we've got no coal industry left. What's happened to our steel industry? It was the most efficient in the world. They've destroyed it. And it's not confined to our own industries. Volvo, they had a massive plant in Ayrshire, and it was subject to a closure motion. And I was asked by a local Socialist Labour Party branch would I go up and speak at the gates of the plant where hundreds of workers were going to lose their jobs. And I went, and you bet your life, television, radio were all there. And I began to speak and say, you will have noticed that while I'm speaking about the evil of what they're doing, not one member of the management, and certainly not the managing director, is coming out here to deal with the questions that I'm posing. And the stupid git came out on the platform with me. And I said to him, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to explain to these workers why you're sacking them. He said, I'll try. I said, is this plant profitable? He said, yes. I said, is it efficient? He said, yes. I said, what about the workforce? Are they good and skilled? He said, they're the best. I said, well, can you explain to the workers why you're moving the plant from Ayrshire in Scotland and replacing it in Poland? Do you know what he said? We can get the work done in Poland 5 times cheaper in labour costs than we can in Scotland. Well, that's one thing that we would stop with free trade, because free trade in terms of movement of capital is as important as free trade in terms of human beings. Incidentally, I've opposed the free movement concept all my life. There's something radically wrong in Britain if you don't understand it. The birth rate in the European Union is around 1.6 to 1.7. The birth rate in Britain is 1.8. To maintain the population level, it needs a birth rate of 2.1. Now that says to me, as someone I think with a logical mind, that the population should be decreasing and not increasing. And yet, during the period from the Lisbon Treaty, the population of Britain has increased from 59 million to 67 million. So where the hell did the 8 million come from? Maybe they came from Mars. Or maybe it was the free flow of people coming in to do work on 0-hour contracts or almost slave labour. Well, that went out, I thought, with the Ark. Certainly in the 1970s it wasn't allowed because trade union leaders wouldn't have allowed it. We were not prepared to see exploitation of workers in one country exported to another country so that they could be further exploited. That's the real politics of horror that we were facing under the so-called free movement of labour and capital. There's no such thing. No socialist can support the idea of free movement. I once addressed a meeting, well, on a number of occasions, at Windsor Castle. They used to put me up. When I went at night, the guard saluted me. Must have been nuts. And on one occasion, I'm addressing a conference of congressmen and senators and governors from America. I think one was called Clinton. And there was one there called Jesse Helms from North Carolina. Now, he was so right-wing that Genghis Khan would have been regarded as a communist. And they certainly didn't like me. I argued a socialist case. They barracked me. I thought, I'm dead right with this lot. Speaking in the afternoon was a bloke called Enoch Powell. And when he stood up, you thought that they'd received a saviour. His first words were, "I must admit that I concede the argument of Arthur Scargill. You cannot have free collective bargaining if you exclude from the principle of free collective bargaining the rights of workers." And they started to boo him. So much for so-called freedom, so much for the concept of movement of labour. I can remember as a young man, 15 years of age, that's when I entered the mining industry, where I worked for 20 years. They wanted to bring Italian miners into Britain in order that they could close the pits in Italy. And we opposed it. The leadership of the union at that time opposed it, and they were right. They weren't prepared to see the exploitation of those in Italy transferred to Britain, where it would have created another problem for our dependents, sons, daughters, granddaughters, grandsons. And that was a right policy. As has been said by a number of speakers today, we're internationalists, yes, but we're also nationalists. We're also people who believe in the sovereignty of our nation to determine its own policy. Tony Benn put it brilliantly when he said, "The European Union is committed by its constitution to the support of capitalism as a system of society. And it is that, as Costa so rightly said, that determines the way in which it operates. Will Italy go the same way as Greece? Will they give in? Or will they take encouragement from what happens in Britain and say, no, we've had enough? The reason why the right is on the increase in Europe is not because that they're suddenly turning into fascists. It's because of disillusionment with the political parties, right, left and centre, who are betraying the very principles which they believed in. And that brings me to the present time and the Labour Party. And they're certainly not going to escape my criticism. I am appalled to see Jeremy Corbyn and the leadership of the Labour Party accepting the principle of a customs union or a singles market, giving in to those within the Labour Party in Parliament and those in Momentum or wherever they are, who are wanting to remain in the European Union. The British people have spoken, and in Labour Party's constituencies, 61% of their constituencies voted to come out. And they should be reflected in Parliament, and Jeremy Corbyn should be saying there will be a complete withdrawal under a Labour government from the European Union, from the customs union and from the single market. It's that kind of policy that will win the votes of the British people. I'm speaking today as a socialist and as a Marxist. Above all, I'm speaking on behalf of all those who hold the view that we've got a right to the sovereignty of our nation, so that no one can dictate to us what we want to see. If we believe in democracy, then democracy means that when we cast a vote, that vote by a majority must determine the way we go. Otherwise, we've got nothing left. It's important to us, if we believe in our principled position, that we fight for that in which we believe. I've been a socialist all my life, and I'll remain a socialist to the day I die. And as part of that campaign, I fought against the membership of the European Economic Community and of the European Union. And again, until and unless that aim is achieved, I'll go on fighting. My statement today to this conference is simple. Don't believe it will simply happen. Go out and fight. Call meetings like this in every town and city in Britain. Begin to tell the people of Britain what's going on and how it's been sabotaged. And then we will be able to stage a demonstration in London with 1 million people saying, no, we're not prepared to accept the sabotage of the right wing in the British Constitution. I believe that if you do that, and you explain to people the evil of the European Union, the negativity of the European Union and all its policies, you will not only help win a free and independent Britain, but far more important, you will create the conditions for the defeat of a Tory government and its replacement by at least a government that will be more progressive and will begin to put into practice those policies essential for a national health service free of charge, upon demand, and at the time of need, from the cradle to the grave, for everyone in society. You'll create also the right to work for every human being, with the average wage for those who can't. We will care for the elderly. We will care for the dispossessed. We will care for those who are being neglected or ignored, because we are socialists and we have an alternative. If you agree with that, go from this conference and campaign for that referendum result to be transferred not into words but into deeds, and leave the European Union.